Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. We are a historically humanist congregation. This is Coffee and Wisdom summertime style. And the last couple of weeks, I've been looking at the transcendentalists. This week, I've been calling it castles in the air, a famous little saying from Henry David Thoreau. Yesterday, I brought up the idea of, wait a minute, how many Thoreaus are there? Yes, on contemporary American television, Thoreau has become a bit of a beefcake, appearing in his cabin shirtless, which no, that wouldn't happen in the 19th century, really. Actually, shirt sleeves were considered underwear in that time period. That's why you always see photos of, in the early photographic days, everyone was wearing a coat. No, it wasn't cold all the time. It was just that you couldn't show your shirt sleeves in those days. And no, you didn't show up at your door without a shirt. But Thoreau is interesting in his many depictions, shall we say. Here's a children's book from little naturalists called Henry David Thoreau in the Woods. You'll notice also here he is wearing a shirt and is kind of buffed up there from carrying logs around. This is absolutely not true. Thoreau did not build a log cabin in the woods. He built his cabin out of scraps, and that was part of what he was doing. He wasn't destroying trees. He was using used wood to build this little place in a way to talk about how we can be saving in the world. So the logs in this particular children's book are completely anachronistic. But hey, here he is with a shirt and a jacket on American television. And they did get the Thoreau cabin correct in that it was actually had shingles on the side. Again, recycled shingles were what actually he used to build his little house in the woods. By golly, there's all kinds of stuff. You too can play the Walden A game, in which you can go out and do some surveying. You can also catch fish on Walden Pond and see if you too can survive in the wilderness. Of course, actually, Walden Pond was not in the wilderness even in the time of Thoreau, and it certainly isn't these days. As a matter of fact, one of the things Thoreau was arguing about in the book was the fact that there was now a commuter train to Boston running very close to the woods and making noise all the time. So again, a little bit anachronistic in terms of what was actually going on. And that's part of the Thoreau problem, I would say, is that people don't really understand what the time period was like. Thoreau also is used very often in advertisements for libertarians. More freedom, less government, says this particular one. That government is best which governs least, says Henry David Thoreau, the proto-libertarian. Well, was he or wasn't he? That's a good question. He did indeed say that in his famous essay that I was talking about on Tuesday, Civil Disobedience. Here is again, DuPage, Illinois libertarians. That government is best, which governs least. Henry David Thoreau, again, signed up for being a libertarian, capital L, and there he is in the woods. You know, we use our historical figures as we use them. And yes, there are some indications that Thoreau was a little bit against government. That's what civil disobedience is all about. But did he meet the criteria for a contemporary libertarian? That's a little more debatable. Thoreau has come in for a lot of criticism. The first article in this kind of reassessment was in the New Yorker in 2015, Catherine Schultz, The Moral Judgments of Henry David Thoreau. In that, she says, why, given his hypocrisy, sanctimony, and misanthropy, has Thoreau been so cherished? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? This is from that article. Although Thoreau is often regarded as a kind of cross between Emerson, John Muir, and William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, the man who emerges in Walden is far closer in spirit to Ayn Rand, suspicious of government, fanatical about individualism, egotistical, elitist, convinced that other people lead pathetic lives, yet categorically opposed to helping them. It is not despite, but because of these qualities that Thoreau makes such a convenient national hero. Well, how does she feel about that? And there is this beginning of a reassessment of Thoreau. And yes, part of this is actually true, and part of it is a little bit made up. This is part of the, Thoreau taking his laundry to his mother in town to do, may or may not be true, probably isn't true actually, but there you have it, a reassessment. And the New Republic says, everybody hates Henry, literary saint or arrogant fraud. Why do we need Thoreau to be one or the other? Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, he was a human being who died young of tuberculosis, but he also wrote some books along the way. And yeah, he probably had very much some prejudices of his time, no doubt about it. He was indeed human. Well, anytime you have one backlash, you're going to have a backlash to the backlash. Here is a book called The Thoreau You Don't Know: What the Prophet of Environmentalism Really Meant by Robert Sullivan. The blurb for that book says this: dispelling common notions of Thoreau as a lonely, eccentric, cloistered at Walden Pond, Sullivan, whom the New York Times Book Review calls an urban Thoreau, I don't know how you can do that, but there you go, paints a dynamic picture of Thoreau as the naturalist who founded our American ideal of the great outdoors, the rugged individual who honed friendships with Ralph Waldo Emerson and other writers, and the political activist who inspired Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, and other influential leaders of progressive change. You know Thoreau is one of America's literary writers, but the Thoreau you don't know may be one of America's greatest heroes. So there you go, around and around it goes. Who is the real Henry? And the answer probably is yes, kind of all of the above and none of the above. That's the way things really work. Well, if we look into the book itself, and this is the inside of the first edition from 1854. So Thoreau was living in the woods in the mid 1840s, and this book comes out 10 years later. He writes this: in most books, the I, or first person, is omitted. We commonly do not remember that it is, after all, always the first person that is speaking. I should not talk so much about myself if there were anybody else whom I knew as well. So he's setting up the use of the I, which was very uncommon in those days. Nowadays, we would probably call Walden creative nonfiction, which means that, yeah, you might change things around a little bit to make it flow a little better. And that is one of the things that Thoreau is often criticized for. All these times and places and occasions are now and here, he says in the book. God himself culminates in the present moment and will never be more divine in the lapse of all the ages. You can hear Emerson in that. This is classic transcendentalism. And we are enabled to apprehend at all what is sublime and noble only by the perpetual instilling and drenching of the reality which surrounds us. Classic transcendentalism, one of the reasons he went to the woods is this idea of having a real personal relationship with reality itself. Time is but the stream I go a-fishing in, he writes in Walden. An interesting way to talk about that. The idea of the stream of consciousness had not yet been invented by William James. That'll be another generation down the way. But who knows, maybe James got the idea from this Thoreau quote. If I knew for a certainty that a man was coming to my house with the conscious design of doing me good, I should run for my life. Well, okay, yes, that might give us some impression that Mr. Thoreau was a little bit of a curmudgeon in that way, a little antisocial. But also, one of the things that we miss often about Thoreau is he had a very, very sardonic and wry sense of humor. He does talk quite a bit in Walden about a spirituality of a transcendental kind. I've mentioned in Coffee and Wisdom before that this was really right at the beginning of the discovery of especially Hindu writings. He had this to say, in the morning, I bathe my intellect in the stupendous and cosmogonal, a word that's disappeared now, philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita. Notice that the title had not yet been regularized in American English, since whose composition years of the gods have elapsed, and in comparison with which our modern world and its literature seem puny and trivial. And I doubt if that philosophy is not to be referred to a previous state of existence so remote is its sublimity from our conceptions. So reading the Bhagavad Gita, very, very early reading of the Bhagavad Gita in American literature, but setting up one of the main streams that's going to go through intellectual culture and artistic culture in the United States all the way to now, and that is the understandings of Hindu writings. He went on to say, I lay down the book and go to my well for water, and lo, there I meet the servant of the Brahmin, priest of Brahma, and Vishnu and Indra, who still sits in his temple on the Ganges reading the Vedas, or dwells at the root of a tree with his crust and water jug. I meet his servant come to draw water for his master, and our buckets, as it were, grate together in the same well. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges. So you see how he's seeing reality. It is this moment at which we all, reality comes together. It's the moment that we need to live within, and very much an idea that's coming out of Hinduism directly into transcendentalism. But you do notice there that one of the things he's also mentioning is the water from Walden. Those of you who have read the book know that one of the things he goes on about a little bit is that Walden was used to cut ice for the use of pre-refrigerators, and the water from Walden was being sent all over the world, indeed was being used in British India at that time. So there is this odd idea of commercialization, but also of religious belief that's going on in Walden. And this is, again, very early in the process that becomes American commercialism. It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. And I've used this quote before because it very much summarizes the way Thoreau saw things, but also the way transcendentalists in general saw reality. Who was Henry? Well, here, if you go to his grave, you will probably see something like this. A great number of writers have visited Henry's grave in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Massachusetts and leave things such as their ink pens and some poems on Henry's grave. Notably and interestingly, yes, Henry has a very small gravestone, which is probably very much in keeping with Henry's idea of the life that he wanted to live. So American writers still make the journey to Henry's grave. I've done that a couple of times, and it's well worth it. Men have become the tools of their tools, writes Thoreau in Walden, and probably that is about as prescient as a statement can get. That's one of the reasons Thoreau continues to be important in American thought. Men have become the tools of their tools, and probably that simply becomes more and more true with time. And something always to remember: the price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it. Yes, your time is the only thing you've got. Karl Marx is going to say that just in a few years down the road, but it remains true today. The price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it. classic words from Walden. We're going to be taking a break through August for Coffee and Wisdom. I'll be back on Tuesday, September the 14th, to look at some more things, coffee and wisdom. I hope you enjoy your dog days of summer and get a lot of good thinking in and go out and find some nature, as did good Henry David Thoreau. And we will be back. Also, don't forget, this Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central Time, we will be celebrating Lammas. What is Lammas? That is the time of the first harvest of wheat in the ancient world, celebrated in many different cultures by the baking of bread. And indeed, we will have hot bread for those who are in attendance at First Unitarian Society, and some music and poetry of the season. See you there, and I'll be back on Coffee and Wisdom on Tuesday, September the 14th. Thank you.